Wichita, Kansas looked ordinary. Quiet streets, family homes, church parking lots, backyard fences, the kind of place where people waved to neighbors, locked their doors at night, and believed danger was something that happened somewhere else. But behind that ordinary surface, someone was watching. He was not a stranger drifting through town. He was not hiding in the shadows every hour of the day. He had a job, a wife, children, a church community. He installed security systems for people who were terrified of the very crimes he was secretly committing. His name was Dennis Rader. But to Wichita, he became known by 3 letters: BTK. Between 1974 and 1991, at least 10 people became victims in Wichita and Park City, Kansas. For years, investigators searched for the person behind the crimes, while the person they were looking for continued living in plain sight. Working, raising a family, attending church, and presenting himself as a normal, rule-following member of the community. That is what makes this case so disturbing. Not only the crimes themselves, but the mask. Dennis Rader was not just hiding from police, he was hiding from everyone. Neighbors saw him as strict, sometimes controlling, but normal. People at church saw a man involved in his community. His family lived beside him for decades without knowing the truth. And all the while, Rader carried a secret identity that he protected like a private world. Then came the letters. He communicated with police and media. He wanted attention. He wanted a name. He wanted the city to know he was still in control. And when he went silent, Wichita was left with a nightmare that became one of America's most infamous cold cases. For years, it seemed like BTK had disappeared, but he had not. He was still there, aging, working, watching, waiting, and then decades later, his own need for recognition pulled him back into the spotlight and eventually led investigators straight to his door. So the chilling question is this: how did a family man, church leader, and security worker live a double life for more than 30 years? And what warning signs were hiding in plain sight the entire time? Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and grew up in Wichita as the oldest of 4 sons. From the outside, nothing about his early life clearly screamed future danger. His father, William, had served in the Marines and later worked for Kansas Gas Service. His mother, Dorothea, worked as a bookkeeper. The family was connected to church. They lived in a world that looked structured, ordinary, and respectable. But inside that ordinary childhood, Rader later described feeling neglected because both parents worked long hours and did not give much attention to the children at home. His father was described as strict and deeply religious, but not abusive. That distinction matters. Rader did not come from the same kind of visibly chaotic childhood we see in many criminal cases. There was no public story of extreme poverty, no obvious broken home, no early record that made him stand out as a future threat. And that is part of what makes him so frightening, because sometimes danger does not grow in visible disaster. Sometimes it grows quietly behind normal routines. As a boy, Rader liked ordinary things: comic books, novels, fishing, Cub Scouts. But underneath those normal interests, something darker was forming. According to the source material, from a young age he had sadistic fantasies involving trapped and helpless women. He also showed cruelty towards small animals and developed secret behaviors involving voyeurism, stolen women's clothing, and bindings. These were not harmless quirks. They were early warning signs of fantasy becoming ritual. In psychology, fantasy matters because it can become a private rehearsal space. A person may not act immediately, but if the fantasy is repeated, it can become part of identity. Rader learned to hide that identity well. After high school, he briefly attended college, then joined the United States Air Force in 1966. He later studied electronics engineering and administration of justice. That detail is chilling because he was learning systems, structure, and law. He served overseas, earned an honorable discharge, and returned to Kansas, while secretly developing the mindset of someone who wanted to control and dominate. In 1971, he married Paula Dietz. They had children. He became a father, a church member, a Cub Scout leader, and eventually worked for ADT Security Services, installing security alarms in homes. Many of those customers were afraid of BTK, never knowing the man helping them feel safe was the same man creating the fear. The psychological foundation was already there: secrecy, fantasy, control, rule obsession, and a need to appear normal. That is the broader lesson. Not every dangerous person looks unstable. Some build a perfect mask, and the mask works because people mistake normal routines for normal character. To understand Dennis Rader, we have to look past the surface. Because on the surface he looked ordinary, including a grandiose sense of self, a need for attention, rigid order, and lack of empathy. That combination is dangerous. But criminal psychology teaches us something important. Normal appearance does not always mean normal inner life. One concept that matters here is antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. In simple terms, this is a long-term pattern where someone violates the rights of others, manipulates situations, lacks empathy, and does not respond to guilt the way most people do. Rader's life showed a disturbing split. Publicly, he followed rules. Privately, he broke the most serious moral boundaries imaginable. He could act strict and organized in public, while hiding fantasies centered on control, domination, and helpless victims. Later psychological evaluation described him with narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive, and antisocial personality traits. Because narcissism says, "I am special." Obsessive control says, "Everything must happen my way." Antisocial traits say, "Other people's suffering does not stop me." Now think about FBI profiling. Investigators often talk about organized versus disorganized offenders. A disorganized offender acts impulsively, leaves obvious mistakes, and may not plan much. Rader was strongly organized. He stalked victims. He gave them code names like projects. He cut phone lines. He brought supplies. He studied routines. Rader was strongly organized. He stalked victims. He gave them code names like projects. He cut phone lines. He brought supplies. He studied routines. But his childhood also matters. Not because it excuses anything, it does not, but because the early warning signs were present. But his childhood also matters. Not because it excuses anything, it does not, but because the early warning signs were present. These behaviors suggest that Rader's fantasy world was developing long before his first known crimes. Psychopathy is another term often connected to cases like this. These behaviors suggest that Rader's fantasy world was developing long before his first known crimes. Psychopathy is another term often connected to cases like this. It involves shallow emotion, manipulation, lack of empathy, and using people as objects. Rader's ability to live as a family man while causing fear shows extreme compartmentalization. It involves shallow emotion, manipulation, lack of empathy, and using people as objects. Rader's ability to live as a family man while causing fear shows extreme compartmentalization. Key takeaway: a person's public image is not always their private reality. Early warning signs like cruelty and stalking should never be dismissed. Patterns matter. If this case helped you understand criminal psychology, warning signs, offender behavior, or how cold cases are solved, subscribe to Criminal Psychology Files, where we study real cases to better recognize danger before the next warning sign is missed. The first warning signs around Dennis Rader were not obvious to the public. They were hidden, private, easy to dismiss if you only saw the version of him he wanted you to see. As a child, Rader appeared normal in many ways. He had hobbies, he went to school, he worked, he joined the military, he married and built a family. But underneath that ordinary life, the warning signs were already there. Sadistic fantasies, cruelty toward animals, voyeuristic behavior, stolen women's clothing, and private rituals involving restraint and control. Those signs matter because they show a person rehearsing power in secret. Not every strange childhood behavior predicts future violence. But when fantasy, cruelty, stalking, and control begin forming a pattern, it should never be ignored. Rader was able to hide because he understood appearances. He learned how to look respectable. He served in the Air Force. He studied criminal justice. He worked for ADT Security Services, installing home alarms for frightened homeowners. That detail is almost impossible to ignore. People were paying him to make them safer, while the man they feared was standing inside their homes. That is one of the deepest system failures in this case. Rader's public mask protected him. People saw the uniform, the job, the church involvement, the family role, and assumed those things meant safety. But later, more warning signs appeared in his adult life. As a compliance officer in Park City, neighbors described him as overzealous and controlling. He was known for enforcing rules harshly, measuring grass, filming homes, and creating fear in people who crossed his path. Some women later described feeling targeted by him. 2 women he stalked in the 1980s and another in the 1990s filed restraining orders against him. One even changed her address to avoid him. That is a major warning sign. A man obsessed with rules in public. A man obsessed with control in private. A man who enjoyed power over people who felt vulnerable. And still, the mask held. The justice system also struggled because BTK became a cold case. Leads faded. Tips failed. Investigators wondered if the offender had died, gone to prison, or stopped because of age or circumstance. But he had not disappeared. He was still living nearby, still watching, still carrying the same fantasy world. The broader lesson is this: systems must learn to connect behavior patterns, not just isolated complaints. Stalking, harassment, cruelty, control, and secret predatory behavior may look separate on paper, but together they can reveal danger long before the public understands what they are seeing. The crimes began on January 15, 1974. Dennis Rader entered the home of the Otero family, Joseph, Julie, and their children. What happened inside that house became the first known attack connected to BTK, and it shattered the idea that home was always a safe place. The victims were not random names in a case file. Joseph Otero was a father. Julie Otero was a mother. Their children had futures, school days, birthdays, and lives that should have continued. When the family's older children came home from school, they discovered the unimaginable. And from that moment, Wichita changed. A private family tragedy became a public fear. People began wondering if someone was watching their homes, their routines, their windows. Then came Catherine Bright. She was only 21. Her brother Kevin was also inside the home, and he survived the attack. His survival mattered deeply because it showed the BTK could make mistakes. He was organized but not invincible. He planned, but real people resisted. Catherine became a victim, and Kevin lived with the trauma of surviving something no one should ever face. Years passed, and then the pattern continued. Shirley Vianne Relford became a victim in 1977. She was a young mother. Her children were inside the home. Rader used fear and control to separate them from what was happening. This is one of the most disturbing psychological patterns in the case. He did not just target people, he controlled environments. He wanted the home, the room, the timing, and the emotional atmosphere under his command. Then came Nancy Jo Fox. Rader had watched her before the attack. He gave her a project name just as he did with others. That word, project, tells us something chilling. It shows how he reduced human beings into fantasies, plans, and trophies inside his own mind. After that, BTK went quiet publicly. But quiet did not mean gone. In 1985, Maureen Hedge became a victim. In 1986, Vicky Wegerle became a victim in her own home. For years, suspicion unfairly surrounded her husband. In 1991, Dolores Davis became one of Rader's final known victims. Across these crimes, the pattern was clear. He stalked, he planned, he entered homes, he used false stories, he restrained victims, He collected personal items, and then he communicated with police and media because the fear itself became part of what he wanted. The community impact was enormous. Wichita was not just grieving. Wichita was being taunted. The person responsible wanted attention and control over the public imagination. That is the broader lesson. Organized offenders often do not only harm individuals, they try to control entire communities through fear. Now we need to ask the deeper question. What was really driving Dennis Rader? At the center of this case was not just violence, it was control. Rader did not simply want to take action against victims. He wanted to plan, rehearse, name, stage, remember, and relive what he did. He called victims projects. He stalked them, he studied their routines, he collected personal items. He communicated with police and media because attention was part of the fantasy. That is organized offender behavior. In FBI, behavioral science, organized offenders often prepare carefully. They choose victims, bring tools, control the scene, and attempt to manage risk. Rader showed that pattern again and again. But the most disturbing part may be his compartmentalization. Compartmentalization means separating different parts of life so they do not emotionally collide. Rader had one life where he was a husband, father, church council member, Cub Scout leader, and compliance officer, and another life where he was BTK. Later, psychological evaluation described him with narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive, and antisocial personality traits, including a need for admiration, rigid control, and lack of empathy. That combination helps explain the double life. Narcissism fed the need to be recognized. Obsessive traits fed the planning and ritual. Antisocial traits allowed him to ignore the suffering of others. And sadistic fantasy tied everything together. Key takeaway: people who live double lives often depend on the trust created by their public image. A job, family, church role, or polite behavior does not automatically mean someone is safe. The broader lesson is simple. The mask is part of the danger. Some offenders do not hide by disappearing, they hide by looking normal. The investigation into BTK was one of the most frustrating cases in American true crime history. Because the person responsible was not leaving a simple trail, he was leaving pieces, letters, phone calls, personal items, false clues, and long gaps of silence. Then, in October 1974, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle. The writer claimed responsibility for the Otero case and used the name BTK. That letter changed everything. BTK was not just avoiding police, he was communicating with them. He wanted recognition. He wanted control over the story. In December 1977, Rader called police from a phone booth and told them where Nancy Jo Fox could be found. The call was recorded and later released. In 1978, police tried something unusual. They worked with KAKE-TV to flash a hidden message during a broadcast, telling him to call the chief. But it did not work. The case kept growing colder. In the 1980s, investigators formed a renewed task force, sometimes called the Ghostbusters, using improving forensic methods. They compared biological samples with hundreds of possible suspects. Most were cleared. Still, BTK remained unidentified. Years passed. Then in 2004, after a newspaper article marked the 30th anniversary of the Otero case, BTK resurfaced. He began sending packages again. Then came the mistake. Rader asked police whether a floppy disk could be traced. Police answered through a classified message, telling him it would be okay. He believed them. In February 2005, he sent a floppy disk to a TV station. Investigators found hidden metadata connected to Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis. Then they saw the black Jeep Cherokee, the same kind of vehicle connected to one of BTK's package drops. Finally, investigators used DNA evidence and compared it through a familial match connected to Rader's daughter. That gave police enough to move. February 25, 2005, Park City, Kansas. For more than 30 years, the man known as BTK had lived inside the same community he had terrified. But by that morning, investigators had enough. The floppy disk, the metadata, the black Jeep and the DNA comparison, the circle was closing. Shortly after noon, police stopped Rader while he was driving near his home. Just a traffic stop. An officer asked, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" Rader replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why." That sentence says a lot. He knew. The secret life was over. Officers searched his home, his vehicle, his church, his office. They collected evidence connected to the hidden world Rader had protected for decades. For Wichita, it was almost impossible to believe. BTK was not a nameless monster. He was Dennis Rader, a husband, a father, a church council president. The next morning, Wichita Police Chief Norman Williams said the words the city had waited decades to hear. BTK is arrested. Section 9. The Trial and Outcome. After Dennis Rader's arrest, the public wanted answers. Not rumors, not symbols, not letters. Answers. On February 28, 2005, Rader was charged with 10 counts. At first, the court entered not guilty pleas on his behalf. But the case was becoming stronger by the day. And then, on June 27, 2005, the expected trial took a sudden turn. Dennis Rader changed his plea to guilty. What happened next shocked many people even more. In open court, Rader calmly described the crimes. He spoke about the victims as projects, as if he were explaining tasks instead of human lives. His tone was cold, controlled, and almost mechanical. There was no real emotional collapse, no deep expression of remorse. For the victims' families, that moment was painful. They were listening to someone explain control. During sentencing, family members gave powerful victim impact statements. They reminded the court that this case was about Joseph, Julie, Josephine, Joseph Jr., Catherine, Shirley, Nancy, Maureen, Vicky, and Dolores. In the end, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years. Life imprisonment became the final legal outcome. Wichita finally had the name behind the fear. But the case also left a lasting question. How can someone sit in church, raise a family, and still hide a life of predatory control? So what does the Dennis Rader case teach us? It teaches us that the most frightening danger is not always the person who looks obviously unstable. Sometimes it is the person who blends in, the person with a job, a family, a church role, a polite public image, a person who understands rules well enough to use them as a mask. Dennis Rader lived for decades as two completely different versions of himself. To the outside world, he was a husband, father, and community leader, but privately, he was carrying a fantasy world. Here are the 3 biggest educational takeaways. 1. Normal appearance is not proof of safe behavior. Character is shown through behavior over time, not public image alone. 2. Control is one of the biggest warning signs. Stalking, intimidation, and lack of empathy should not be dismissed as just being strict. When control becomes a pattern, it can become dangerous. 3. Persistence solves cases. Cold cases can still move forward when investigators preserve evidence and use new technology carefully. In the end, Rader's story is about the mask. If this case helped you understand criminal psychology, subscribe to Criminal Psychology Files, where we study real cases to better recognize danger before the next warning sign is missed. Stay curious, stay safe.